Challenger, go and throttle up. Challenger, go and throttle up.
73 seconds. That's all it took for one of America's proudest missions to turn into a national nightmare. But beyond the fireball and headlines, there are unanswered questions. 17 of them. Some are chilling, some are strange, and a few are almost unbelievable. Why did warnings vanish into silence? Why was a children's icon nearly packed for orbit? And how could someone predict the very way it would all fail? These 17 strange things about Challenger still defy explanation and might change how you see it forever. Number 17. Engineers saw it coming. The Challenger wasn't destroyed by an unpredictable accident. It failed in precisely the way engineers had warned it would. For years before the launch, NASA contractors documented troubling evidence about the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. The culprit was a small but crucial component, the O-ring seals. These rubber gaskets were designed to keep fiery exhaust gases from escaping the rocket's joints. But under cold conditions, they stiffened, lost flexibility, and sometimes failed to form a proper seal. By 1985, multiple test flights had already shown blow-by, hot gases slipping past the O-rings during ignition. Engineers raised alarms, but NASA brushed them aside, categorizing the risk as acceptable. That acceptance would prove fatal. The night before the Challenger launch, temperatures came crashing down to an all-time low at Cape Canaveral. Engineers at Morton Thiokol got hold of emergency data and urged NASA to not countenance a launch in such cold conditions, since they would definitely compromise the scenario with the O-ring. The engineers never predicted a general risk. They gave a precise forecast of the specific failure scenario, which had the O-rings hardening and losing their seal to allow fire to propagate through the booster joints. But rather than heed the advice, management of NASA shot back for evidence indicating an absolute disaster. The engineers failed to sway them, as the shuttle exploding was judged not a surety, hence disregarding the need for a delay in launch. 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger shattered on cue. The O-ring failed, exhaust gases ignited the external fuel tank, and the shuttle was destroyed. The engineers were 100% right, but their voices were drowned by bureaucracy and pressure. Don't get too comfortable yet. The next point is even harder to ignore. Number 16. NASA ignored a direct warning. The Challenger disaster wasn't unforeseen, it was predicted. The night before launch, on January 27, 1986, engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, held an urgent teleconference with NASA. Their warning could not have been clearer. Do not launch tomorrow. The engineers had data showing that the shuttle's O-rings, small rubber seals critical to preventing hot gases from escaping, became dangerously brittle in cold weather. Forecasts showed Cape Canaveral would be experiencing record low temperatures the next morning, far colder than any previous shuttle launch. One engineer, Bob Ebeling, was so convinced disaster was inevitable that he went home and told his wife, "It's going to blow up." The NASA officials, too, were under a lot of pressure to keep the shuttle program running on schedule, and at this point had to weigh against the engineers' claims. They thought the engineers hadn't gathered enough evidence to justify a delay.
Private contractors that wanted experiments done in space would pay them.
After hours of tense discussion, Morton Thiokol management caved to NASA's pressure, reversing the engineers' original recommendation and granting approval for the launch. In hindsight, such a decision seems impossible. Considering the criteria that the engineers had specified, failure of the Challenger due to an O-ring compromised by the cold, it is easily ignored for optics, schedule, and politics, rather than live safety. The O-rings did precisely what the engineers had feared. They failed when ignited by the shuttle. It was not an accident. It was the result of ignoring a warning that could have saved 7 lives. Number 15. The crew's final 2 minutes. For years, the public was told that the Challenger crew died instantly in the explosion. It was a comforting narrative that their suffering was brief, that they never knew what happened. But later, evidence paints a far darker, more haunting picture. The astronauts may have survived the blast itself. The explosion at 73 seconds wasn't technically an explosion in the Hollywood sense, but a massive rupture of the external fuel tank. The orbiter's crew cabin, reinforced and separated from the tanks, was blasted clear and remained structurally intact as it arced through the sky. Investigations later showed that cabin pressure was not lost in that instant. This means the crew was likely alive, fully conscious, during the 3-mile, 2-minute plunge back to Earth. The further shuddering realization is that active oxygen packs were found being worn by astronauts Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, and Ellison Onizuka. Because these packs had to be activated manually, it is thus certain that at least some members of the crew were awake and aware after the breakup of the shuttle. The horrifying thought remains that they may have lived through the entire fall and met instant death upon crashing into the ocean at over 200 miles per hour.
Apparently exploded.
Your vehicle has exploded.
We're looking at...
In stark contrast to this possibility, NASA has held on to the credence that the crew was slayed instantly, perhaps both to protect the public and themselves from the unbearable truth. The evidence is against the story. The astronauts did not die instantly in a flare of fire. They confronted nearly 2 full minutes of terror, knowing fully well that there was nothing that could be done to save them. Number 14. A children's icon in orbit? As if sending a teacher into orbit wasn't enough of a publicity move, NASA nearly went a step further. In the early 1980s, the agency quietly considered adding one of television's most beloved children's icons to a shuttle crew, Big Bird from Sesame Street.
46 years later, Spinny is coming out from behind the beak, the subject of a new documentary titled I Am Big Bird.
Carol Spinney, the puppeteer behind the 8-foot-tall yellow character, later confirmed that NASA approached him about flying Big Bird aboard a shuttle mission. The idea was simple but ambitious. Have Big Bird orbit the Earth to inspire children worldwide, blending education with space spectacle. Imagine classroom segments taught not only by Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space, but also by Big Bird floating in zero gravity. However, the plan ran into trouble immediately. The costume itself was huge and would have been almost impossible to squeeze into the shuttle's cramped interior. Apart from logistics, the astronauts were concerned about the elephantine suit getting in the way of their safety in an emergency. Ultimately, NASA scrapped the plan, although it surely indicated the lengths to which NASA was willing to go to gain public attention. In retrospect, that thought is very chilling. Had Challenger been carrying not just a teacher but a children's television icon, millions of kids tuned in live might have lost their hero along with the astronauts. Even without Big Bird, the tragedy created a traumatic event for the entire generation of school children. Nonetheless, the very serious consideration by NASA of placing a Muppet on a rocket clearly points to how far the program's priorities had drifted from science and safety toward publicity stunts and media spectacles. Number 13. NASA's own rules were violated. The most disturbing fact about the Challenger launch is that it never should have happened at all. Not just because of warnings from engineers, but because it directly violated NASA's own rules. Launch protocols clearly prohibited missions in extreme cold, and for good reason. Critical components of the shuttle, especially the O-rings, weren't designed to perform safely in sub-freezing temperatures. On the morning of January 28, 1986, Cape Canaveral recorded a shocking 22 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest launch day in shuttle history.
Good roll program confirmed.
Icicles were visible hanging from the launch pad. Fuel lines and valves had never been tested under such conditions. Yet instead of postponing, NASA management pressed ahead, desperate to meet scheduling goals. Former NASA chief scientist Ken Iliff later stated flatly, that ignoring this regulation was the root cause of the accident. The rules were there to protect astronauts' lives, but management treated them as flexible guidelines rather than binding safety requirements. It was not merely a case of neglect, it was systemic. With all the efforts put in to make space travel appear routine, NASA cut corners and made it a standard practice. The entire Challenger launch was a part of a larger goal, achieving up to 24 shuttle missions per year, one requiring bending rules and stretching limits. Catastrophic consequences were inevitable. Ignoring all safety measures made NASA's life a gamble, and the game was lost. Destruction by Challenger, not only it was a tragedy, but also a preventable affair. Create by culture, high in schedule, politics, and public face over the very standards designed to keep astronauts safe. Number 12. The chilling Apollo 1 anniversary. If the Challenger disaster feels almost cursed by timing, that's because it happened on a date already stained by tragedy in America's space program. Challenger launched on January 28, 1986, just one day after the 19th anniversary of the Apollo 1 fire. On January 27, 1967, astronauts Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were slayed when a fire broke out in their command module during a ground test at Cape Kennedy. That accident was NASA's first crewed spaceflight fatality and served as a grim warning about the cost of ignoring engineering concerns. 19 years later, Challenger lifted off almost in symbolic defiance of that memory. But far from honoring Apollo 1's legacy, NASA seemed to have repeated the same fatal mistakes, ignoring engineers, dismissing safety risks, and pushing ahead despite warnings.
All I know is that it's away from goodness in our experience space.
The date itself is a striking coincidence. Two disasters, separated by exactly 19 years, both caused by preventable oversights. Even more disturbing is that the leaders of NASA could have known about the symbolism and consciously decided not to postpone. It would have been one more deliberate statement of progress. How far the space program has come since its darkest day, Apollo 1 anniversary, and shuttle launch in such proximity to Apollo 1, remembrance could have boosted morale. Instead, that week, with the destruction of Challenger, history forever linked the two disasters. The Apollo 1 fire had been an object lesson. Challenger showed NASA still hadn't learned the lesson. It was as if the history called again for justice. Number 11. When politics trumped safety. The decision to launch Challenger wasn't made in a vacuum.
Space Shuttle Challenger. Lift off from a freezing cold Florida to the cheers of the young students.
Behind the scenes, political pressure from Washington may have played a decisive role. On the evening of January 28, 1986, the same day Challenger was scheduled to fly, President Ronald Reagan was set to deliver his annual State of the Union address. The inclusion of Christa McAuliffe, the first teacher in space, provided the perfect opportunity for Reagan to highlight American ingenuity, education, and leadership in the space age. Had the launch gone as planned, Reagan could have spoken to a nation buzzing with pride, with school children watching from classrooms and adults marveling at a new era of spaceflight. Instead, the explosion forced him to postpone the address and deliver one of the most somber speeches of his presidency. But the timing has fueled decades of speculation. Was NASA under subtle or not so subtle pressure to keep the launch schedule so the mission could align with Reagan's televised moment? Some ex-officials contend that NASA was faced with tremendous expectations from the political establishment to demonstrate that the shuttle program was reliable and routine. Another scrubbed launch would have been embarrassingly damaging after all the cost and risk of delays and technical difficulties. With the push of Challenger that fateful morning, NASA was not only answering to engineers but White House, Congress, and public opinion of the United States. In the end, the political optics apparently outweighed the safety of the astronauts. What became a rush to give Reagan yet another victory turned into one of the darkest tragedies ever televised in America. Number 10. NASA's culture of silence. The Challenger disaster wasn't only the result of technical failure.
The shuttle exploding, science were watching, children were watching.
It was also the product of a culture that discouraged dissent. Within NASA and its contractors, speaking out against management decisions often came with professional consequences. The engineers at Morton Thiokol, who tried to stop the launch, knew this all too well. When they presented their concerns about the O-rings during the fateful teleconference, management essentially told them to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. In other words, stop warning about safety and fall in line. This wasn't an isolated moment. NASA's internal culture prized schedule, public image, and institutional reputation over transparency. Warnings were reframed as mere opinions, while optimism and compliance were rewarded. Even after the tragedy, whistleblowers like engineer Roger Boisjoli described how the system punished those who spoke up. Boisjoli, who had forcefully argued against launching in the cold, was sidelined and eventually left the industry, emotionally broken by how his warnings had been ignored. NASA's leadership first downplayed the evidence that suggested the crew might have survived the explosion instead of handling a more comforting narrative. Again and again, very convenient truths were submerged beneath layers of bureaucracy and public relations. That culture of silence proved to be as lethal as frozen O-rings. It fostered an atmosphere where known risks were accepted, warnings were ignored, and catastrophe became virtually inevitable. Challenger was more than a hardware failure. It was a communication fiasco. If that shocked you, just wait. What happened after the disaster may be even harder to believe. Number 9. The Rogers Commission controversy. In the wake of Challenger's destruction, the White House quickly formed a special panel to investigate. Officially named the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident,
so I am today announcing the formation of a Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger's accident.
it became better known as the Rogers Commission, after its chairman, former Secretary of State William P. Rogers. Its mission was to uncover the truth. But from the very start, controversy swirled around how much truth NASA was willing to let out. NASA managers attempted to control the narrative, emphasizing the unexpected nature of the failure while minimizing prior warnings. Some whistleblower testimony was nearly buried under layers of technical jargon and bureaucratic obfuscation. If not for persistent members of the commission, crucial details might never have surfaced. Among the members was physicist Richard Feynman, who, in effect, became the conscience of the investigation. Frustrated with evasive answers, Feynman very famously performed a straightforward but devastating demonstration on live television, dropping a piece of O-ring material into a glass of ice water. Immediately, the rubber hardened, thereby proving that the warnings given by the engineers were indeed correct. That moment pierced through months of NASA spin and gave the public the reason why Challenger failed. The Commission will conclude that NASA failed in adhering to its own safety standards, succumbing instead to the pressures of politics and deadlines. Yet, even this last commissioned report was criticized for being too diplomatic and for protecting high-ranking officials from accountability. The Rogers Commission exposed system-wide failures and, more so, underlined the unwillingness of NASA and government to fully face the truth. For Challenger was not just a tragedy, it was a slowly unfolding scandal. Number 8. Survivability was covered up. One of the darkest and most unsettling aspects of the Challenger disaster is how long NASA maintained the narrative that the crew died instantly in the explosion. It was, in many ways, a comforting story, quick, merciful, and final. But later evidence shattered that illusion and suggested something far more disturbing. The crew may have remained alive and conscious for the full 2.5-minute fall to the ocean. Investigations revealed that the crew cabin had remained intact after the breakup of the shuttle. More damning still, 3 astronauts' personal emergency air packs were found switched on. These systems weren't automated. They had to be activated by hand. This meant at least some of the crew were alive, functioning, and aware enough to attempt survival measures. NASA resisted confronting this possibility and instead chose to shield the public and itself from a dreadful realization. The official reports emphasized instantaneous death to preclude any question as to whether something could have been done or whether different safety measures might have saved them. Only through independent reporting, such as a Miami Herald Tropic magazine investigation, could that truth be revealed which the agency had hidden. The cover-up raises agonizing questions. Why would NASA deprive the public of this reality? Was it mercy toward the grieving families, or a cold, calculated gesture intended to save its own reputation and protect the shuttle program? Either way, the decision glossed over the human account of Challenger's last moments. The astronauts simply didn't disappear in a sudden flash of fire. They may have had unimaginable awareness all through their descent. Number 7. The soccer ball that outlived them. Amid the wreckage of Challenger, one object became a haunting symbol of survival: a simple soccer ball. Astronaut Ellison Onizuka, a father of 2, had brought the ball on board as a memento for his daughter Janelle's high school soccer team.
One of the unlikely survivors of the failed launch is a tattered soccer ball.
It was meant to be a keepsake, a small gesture connecting his family and community to his historic journey into space. After the disaster, divers recovering debris from the Atlantic made a stunning discovery. Despite the inferno, the violent breakup of the shuttle, and the catastrophic fall, the soccer ball had somehow survived intact. Scorched and battered, but recognizable, it was eventually returned to Onizuka's family and later placed on display at Clear Lake High School in Texas, where his daughter was a student. The ball became an eerie contrast to the tragedy. How could an inanimate object endure the violent forces that slain 7 highly trained astronauts? The symbolism was impossible to ignore. A father's gift lived on while the man himself was gone. And decades later, in 2016, Shane Kimbrough, who himself had a daughter go to Clear Lake High, carried the same soccer ball with him to the International Space Station. In February 2017, he shared a picture of the soccer ball gracefully floating away in weightlessness, fulfilling Onizuka's own wish. The ball's journey reflects a bizarre, almost surreal story of the Challenger disaster. While technology and people were lost, this fragile artifact of everyday life was spared to be a reminder of the tragedy and the resilience of spirit. Number 6. When the ocean held the crew. The Challenger disaster wasn't over when the shuttle disintegrated in the sky. In many ways, the most harrowing chapter began afterward, with a massive recovery operation spread across the Atlantic Ocean.
A piece of the Space Shuttle Challenger, a piece, has been found in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Florida.
Debris from the shuttle rained into the water over a vast area, forcing the U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, and civilian contractors into one of the largest salvage efforts in American history. For weeks, ships and divers scoured the sea, hauling thousands of fragments to the surface. Every piece mattered, both for understanding what went wrong and for offering closure to the families of the crew. But the most difficult task was locating the crew compartment. 6 weeks after the disaster, divers finally found it, resting 100 feet below the surface, about 15 miles east of Cape Canaveral. Inside were the remains of the 7 astronauts. Recovery operations for the crew were carried out in near secrecy, with very few public details. The families were provided with what could be positively identified. The unidentified remains were buried at Arlington National Cemetery in a memorial to the Challenger crew. The intent behind the secrecy was to not only protect grieving relatives, but also to protect the nation from the grim spectacle of the incident. It was an emotionally grueling undertaking for the divers and recovery teams. They were not just salvaging machines. They were retrieving lives that had been horribly cut short. Months-long efforts served to remind everyone that the Challenger disaster was not merely one awful explosion flickering across a television screen, but a long and sorrowful maritime ceremony stretching far into the abyss of the cold sea. Number 5. Challenger. Debris still washes ashore. One of the strangest aspects of the Challenger tragedy is that it refuses to stay in the past, literally. Even years after the explosion, pieces of the shuttle continued to resurface along Florida's coastline. The Atlantic Ocean, which swallowed Challenger in 1986, kept giving back fragments of the doomed spacecraft, like ghostly reminders.
25 years of Americans in space, never in 25 launches of the space shuttle had a life been lost.
In December 1996, nearly 11 years after the disaster, beachgoers in Cocoa Beach discovered 2 large pieces of debris that had washed ashore. The fragments were so substantial that NASA had to bring in heavy machinery to haul them away. This wasn't an isolated event. Over the decades, additional wreckage has occasionally been spotted by fishermen, divers, and coastal residents. Each new discovery forces the painful memory back into public view. Discovered by accident through the years, Challenger has also been found lying on the bottom of the sea. While searching for World War II wrecks in 2022, divers found a considerable piece of Challenger lying just off the Florida coast. NASA confirmed it was indeed authentic, though, in its opinion, this was not wreckage but rather a memorial site. Recurrent discoveries then serve as haunting reminders that the story of the Challenger has not yet been put to rest. For some, such remnants are symbols of mourning hard to figure, a spaceship that still stands quite literally in parts. For NASA, every bit is evidence of past shortcomings, but every piece is equally a token of commemoration of those who were lost. Challenger, with her pieces scattered and at anchor, drops back to shore like whispers from history. Number 4. The cost of launch obsession. At the core of the Challenger disaster was NASA's relentless drive to make spaceflight routine. In the early 1980s, the shuttle program was marketed as a revolutionary step forward, a reusable spacecraft that could fly so frequently it would make rockets obsolete. NASA set an ambitious target, 24 missions per year, essentially 2 launches every month. That number was far beyond what its infrastructure and workforce could realistically support. This obsession with launch frequency created dangerous pressure. Engineers and managers were expected to treat the shuttle like an airline, not a complex experimental vehicle. Delays were frowned upon, setbacks were embarrassing, and every canceled launch was seen as a public failure. The illusion of safe, routine access to space mattered more than the reality of the risks. If it were on schedule, January 1986, the mission of the Challenger had gone through several days of delay because of weather and technical problems. Every subsequent delay simply piled on pressure to get that shuttle off the pad. NASA management was fully aware that Krista McAuliffe's presence as the first teacher in space had drawn unbounded public attention. A further scrub of the launch would have tarnished the shuttle's reputation, thereby bringing a blow to NASA's credibility. In this climate, the cold weather and O-ring safety considerations were not so much warnings as impediments to meeting schedules, and impediments had to be eliminated. When NASA prioritized frequency over safety considerations, it virtually turned a space vehicle into a time bomb. Number 3. Lessons NASA failed to keep. In the aftermath of Challenger, NASA vowed that nothing like it would ever happen again. The shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years, while the Rogers Commission's recommendations were implemented. O-rings were redesigned, safety checks were tightened, and NASA publicly promised a new culture of caution. For a while, it seemed as if those lessons had stuck, but history has a way of repeating itself. 17 years later, in 2003, the shuttle Columbia was destroyed during re-entry after foam insulation broke off from the external tank at launch.
A more courageous group of people you could not have hoped to know.
Once again, engineers had warned of the risk, and once again, those warnings were downplayed or ignored. The same culture that silenced concerns before Challenger had re-emerged, showing how difficult it is to truly change an institution under pressure. Failures of NASA breed a disturbing question. Has the agency fixed the technical faults while leaving the cultural ones untouched? The Rogers Commission itself warned that it was not only hardware that was an issue, the deeper concern was with management and communication, along with the fact that schedule was prioritized over safety. Challenger and Columbia taken together suggest those deeper flaws were never totally settled. Today, even as NASA enters into partnership with private companies preparing to launch missions to Mars, the warning lesson from Challenger is all the more evident. Ambition and progress must be weighed against risk and humility. This tragedy was not only a technical failure, it was a lesson about human pride. Number 2. Pilot Mike Smith's last words. Among the fragments of data recovered from the Challenger's final moments, one detail stands out as especially haunting: the last recorded words of pilot Mike Smith. Just seconds before the shuttle tore apart, as alarms blared and warning lights flashed, the cabin microphones captured Smith's voice. He said a single word: "Uh-oh." It may not sound like much, but it carries immense weight. In that brief syllable lies the realization that something had gone terribly wrong. Smith, an experienced Navy pilot and test aviator, was trained to recognize danger instantly. His "uh-oh" was not casual. It was the response of a professional who understood, in that instant, that a catastrophic failure was unfolding. What makes this moment haunting is the fact that it had very little recorded. NASA revealed no further evidence of crew dialogue, prompting questions of what else was said. Did they talk to each other as the shuttle broke apart? Did they try to problem solve in those desperate seconds? The official record says nothing. Smith's last words, however, serve to remind us tragically that the crew of Challenger did not die without awareness of what has happened. It was not as though they were suddenly snuffed out in an instant. They saw and felt disaster develop. That single "uh-oh" may be the last remaining trace of humanity in those last moments. Just when you thought it couldn't get darker, the next chapter shows how tragedy unfolded on the biggest stage possible. Number 1. Christa McAuliffe's fateful mission. At the heart of Challenger's story was Christa McAuliffe, a 37-year-old social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. Selected from more than 11,000 applicants for NASA's new Teacher in Space program, McAuliffe was meant to embody accessibility, inspiration, and the idea that space exploration was no longer the domain of test pilots and scientists alone. She was a mother of 2, a classroom educator, and a symbol of ordinary Americans reaching for the stars. NASA envisioned her lessons from orbit as a way to reignite public enthusiasm for the shuttle program, which had begun to feel routine to the public by the mid-1980s. Media coverage was intense. For the first time, a shuttle launch wasn't just for engineers and space buffs. It was front-page news across the country. NASA even provided a live satellite feed directly to schools. Thousands of children, including McAuliffe's own students, tuned in to watch her historic flight. Instead, they witnessed a national calamity in real time. An explosion occurred some 45 seconds to a minute after liftoff, blurring the memories of an entire generation with the sight of white smoke and fire. For those children, many of whom had looked up to McAuliffe as a relatable hero, the trauma was immediate and far-reaching. The Challenger disaster leaves behind questions, lessons, and mysteries that still echo decades later. Which of these 17 strange details shocked you the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video eye-opening, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold stories, and share it with someone who should see it. And don't stop here. Click the video on your screen now for another story you won't want to miss.